At 18:20 local time on August 23, 2000, Gulf Air Flight 072 prepared for its final descent into Bahrain International Airport. The Airbus A320, a workhorse of modern aviation, was in pristine condition. Its twin engines hummed in perfect unison, carrying 143 souls on board, 135 passengers, and 8 crew members. Among them were business travelers returning home, families reuniting, and a handful of tourists eager to explore the Gulf region. It was supposed to be an uneventful journey, a short hop from Cairo, Egypt, to Manama, Bahrain. But what lay ahead was a chain of fateful decisions that would seal their tragic fate. The sun hung low over the Persian Gulf, casting an orange glow across the horizon. The waters below reflected a serene calmness, broken only by the occasional ripple of a passing vessel. In the cockpit, Captain Ahab Al-Adin and First Officer Ahmed Omar approached their final leg of the journey. The flight had been smooth, with only light turbulence along the way. As they neared Bahrain, the city lights flickered in the growing dusk, a welcoming sight to those eager to disembark. But behind the controlled demeanor of the cockpit crew lurked an unseen element: fatigue. Captain Al-Adin, a seasoned pilot with nearly 7,000 hours of flying experience, had spent long hours on duty. First Officer Omar, though competent, was relatively less experienced. Their mental sharpness, already dulled by exhaustion, would soon be tested in ways no one could have foreseen. At 19:21 local time, Air Traffic Control cleared Flight 072 for an approach to runway 12. The captain acknowledged the instruction, and the aircraft initiated its descent. The descent profile called for a steady reduction in altitude, ensuring a smooth and controlled approach. But then, a critical moment arose, one that would set the stage for catastrophe. As the aircraft neared the airport, the pilots were instructed to circle for a second approach. It was a standard procedure, often necessary due to air traffic congestion or weather considerations. But instead of executing a controlled go-around, the descent became erratic. The aircraft, rather than maintaining a stabilized approach, began, descending too steeply, far beyond safe parameters. Inside the cabin, passengers were unaware of the unfolding crisis. Some gazed out the windows, watching the city lights grow closer, expecting a routine landing. Flight attendants buckled in for arrival, prepared for the final minutes of the flight. The gentle hum of the engines, the occasional crackle of the intercom. These were the last sounds of normalcy before everything changed. Back in the cockpit, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The pilots, disoriented and struggling to regain control, allowed the aircraft to sink dangerously close to the water. The automated systems on board, the very safeguards designed to prevent such errors, began issuing warnings. The Ground Proximity Warning System, GPWS, blared its urgent message, "Pull up! Pull up!" But the response was sluggish, confused. What followed next was a moment of sheer horror. The aircraft, now in a perilous nose-down attitude, plunged toward the sea. At 19:30 local time, just 3 nautical miles from the runway, Gulf Air Flight 072 slammed into the waters of the Persian Gulf at high speed. The impact was devastating. The fuselage shattered upon contact, sending debris scattering across the water. Within seconds, the once intact Airbus was reduced to wreckage, sinking into the depths. From the shore, onlookers stood frozen in shock. Fishermen, who had been tending to their nets, turned their heads toward the fiery splash. The sky, moments ago a serene dusk, was now clouded with smoke and mist from the explosion. Rescue boats were dispatched immediately, their sirens wailing against the still night air. But as they reached the crash site, hope dwindled. There were no signs of survivors. What had gone wrong? How could an experienced flight crew aboard a well-maintained aircraft fail so catastrophically in the final minutes of flight? These questions would soon drive one of the most perplexing investigations in Gulf Air's history. For now, however, the only certainty was the heartbreaking loss of 143 lives, a tragedy that had unfolded in mere moments, leaving the world to wonder. What were they thinking? The waters of the Persian Gulf, usually calm and unbothered, now held the remains of Gulf Air Flight 072, a grim testament to a tragedy that had unfolded in a matter of seconds. The burning wreckage, though partially submerged, still smoldered in the cool evening air. Emergency response teams scrambled toward the crash site, their boats cutting through the water with urgent precision. What had begun as a normal approach to Bahrain International Airport had ended in catastrophe, leaving 143 souls lost in an instant. From the control tower at Bahrain International Airport, air traffic controllers were frozen in horror. They had watched the Airbus A320's final moments on their radar screens. The descent profile had been erratic, the altitude dropping at an alarming rate. Then, nothing. The blip representing Flight 072 had vanished. The silence that followed was deafening. Calls to the aircraft went unanswered. Controllers tried, reaching other pilots in the vicinity to confirm what they feared. The reports came quickly. An explosion, fire on the water, wreckage. Flight 072 was gone. Back on land, panic spread among the waiting families. In the arrivals hall, where loved ones had gathered to welcome passengers home, a growing sense of unease turned into raw terror. The digital arrival board still displayed the flight as on approach, but the minutes stretched into unbearable uncertainty. Some passengers' families noticed the flurry of emergency vehicles rushing toward the coastline, sirens piercing through the humid evening air. Soon, the murmurs in the terminal turned into outright panic. Then, the announcement came, a Gulf Air representative, his voice shaking despite his attempts at composure, addressed the anxious crowd. "We regret to inform you that Gulf Air Flight 072 has been involved in an accident near Bahrain International Airport." The room erupted. Wails of grief, cries of disbelief, and desperate prayers filled the space. People fell to their knees, clutching at anything to steady themselves. Others stood motionless, the weight of the news too much to bear. At the crash site, the rescue effort quickly turned into a grim recovery operation. Within the first hour, Bahraini Coast Guard units and divers arrived, scanning the dark waters for any sign of survivors. The odds, however, were against them. The force of impact had been catastrophic. The aircraft had broken apart, its fuselage twisted and scattered across the sea floor. Small pieces of debris, seats, oxygen masks, luggage, bobbed on the surface, carried by gentle waves. A few hours later, the first bodies were pulled from the wreckage. Most had suffered fatal injuries upon impact. The rescue workers moved with solemn urgency, retrieving victims with careful reverence. Each body was tagged, documented, and prepared for transport back to shore. Despite their professionalism, many of the first responders found it difficult to process what they were witnessing. For many of them, this was the worst disaster they had ever encountered. News of the crash spread rapidly. Within minutes, Gulf Air officials in Manama were notified, triggering an emergency response protocol. Calls were made to the airline's headquarters in Abu Dhabi, and a crisis team was assembled. The Bahraini government was briefed, and soon, international aviation authorities, including Airbus and the French Bureau of Inquiry and Analysis for Civil Aviation Safety, BEA, were on their way. The investigation had begun, but for now, all that mattered was understanding the scope of the devastation. By midnight, the full extent of the tragedy became clear. There were no survivors. All 143 people on board, pilots, crew, and passengers, had perished. Families who had been holding on to hope were now faced with a crushing reality. The airport set up crisis centers, where grief counselors and medical personnel worked tirelessly to comfort the bereaved. Some family members refused to believe the news, demanding more answers. Others collapsed in despair, inconsolable in their heartbreak. Media outlets picked up the story almost immediately. News channels broadcast images of the crash site, burning wreckage on the sea, emergency boats combing the water, rescue workers carrying body bags to shore. The footage was haunting. The world watched as yet another aviation disaster unfolded, adding to a grim list of air tragedies that year. But even as the shock settled in, one question loomed over the unfolding crisis. What had caused this tragedy? The aircraft was modern, its last maintenance check had been flawless, and there had been no distress call from the pilots. Was it mechanical failure, weather, a terrorist attack, or, more unsettlingly, had human error played a role? The investigation would soon reveal disturbing details about the final moments of Flight 072, but for now, only uncertainty remained. As dawn broke over Bahrain, the recovery efforts continued. Divers worked tirelessly, retrieving more wreckage and remains from the seabed. The Airbus A320's flight recorders, its black boxes, became the most critical target. Investigators knew that within these devices lay the truth about Flight 072's doomed descent. Somewhere in the depths of the Gulf, among the wreckage and scattered belongings of those lost, were the answers the world desperately sought. For now, however, one thing was certain. Gulf Air Flight 072 had gone down in a way that should never have happened. And the world was about to find out why. As the first light of dawn stretched across the horizon, the waters of the Persian Gulf remained eerily calm, an unsettling contrast to the night before. The wreckage of Gulf Air Flight 072, now partially submerged, was scattered across a vast debris field. The shattered remains of the once proud Airbus A320 floated on the surface, while the majority of its structure had settled beneath the waves. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burnt fuel, a haunting reminder of the violent impact that had claimed 143 lives. By early morning, investigative teams had begun arriving in Bahrain. The Bahraini Civil Aviation Affairs, BCAA, took immediate charge of the response, but given the complexity of an air disaster, external experts were called in. The French Bureau of Inquiry and Analysis for Civil Aviation Safety, BEA, representing Airbus, dispatched investigators, as did the United States National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, due to the aircraft's American-made engines. It was a race against time. Every minute mattered in recovering evidence before ocean currents carried away vital clues. The hunt for the black boxes. The first priority was clear: finding the aircraft's flight data recorder, FDR, and cockpit voice recorder, CVR, the black boxes that held the last moments of Flight 072. These devices, designed to withstand extreme impacts, were the key to understanding what had gone so terribly wrong. Within hours, sonar-equipped boats had begun scanning the seabed. Divers, battling poor visibility and strong undercurrents, methodically searched the wreckage. It wasn't long before they made their first breakthrough. One of the black boxes was located amidst a tangled mass of debris. Shortly after, the second recorder was retrieved. Both were rushed to the BCAA's forensic team for analysis. Now, the world waited. The answers were there, locked within those two devices, but what they would reveal was still unknown. Eyewitness accounts and ATC analysis. While the forensic teams worked, investigators turned to another crucial source of information: eyewitnesses and air traffic control recordings. Bahrain's air traffic controllers were among the last people to have contact with the doomed flight. Their transmissions were scrutinized frame by frame, word by word. The initial findings raised immediate concerns. There had been no distress call, no indication from the pilots that anything was wrong. The only abnormality noted was the erratic descent pattern of the aircraft, something that had puzzled controllers even before the crash. Eyewitness reports from the shore painted a disturbing picture. Fishermen who had been out on the water that evening described seeing the aircraft in a steep, nose-down attitude just seconds before impact. Some even reported glimpses of flashing lights, possibly warning indicators from the aircraft. But what was most chilling was the confirmation that the plane never attempted to level out. It simply continued its dive straight into the sea. The first theories, with the black boxes in hand and preliminary data gathered, experts began forming their first theories. Could this have been a mechanical failure? The Airbus A320 was equipped with an advanced fly-by-wire system, meaning its flight controls were computer-assisted. If a critical system had malfunctioned, perhaps a faulty altimeter or an engine thrust anomaly, it could have sent the plane into an uncontrolled descent. But initial maintenance records suggested otherwise. The aircraft had undergone routine inspections just days before the flight. No mechanical issues had been reported. In fact, Airbus engineers, reviewing the jet's service history, found nothing that would indicate a catastrophic failure. Then, attention shifted to weather conditions. Could turbulence or microbursts have forced the aircraft into a loss of control? A review of meteorological data, however, ruled this out. The skies over Bahrain that evening had been clear. There were no storm systems, no wind shear alerts, and no reports from other pilots of adverse conditions. With mechanical failure and weather ruled out, a far more unsettling possibility began to emerge: human error, uncovering a troubling pattern as investigators dug deeper into the history of Gulf Air Flight 072. They uncovered an unsettling detail. This was not the first time the airline had faced concerns over cockpit discipline and procedural adherence. Reports surfaced about previous flights where pilots had engaged in excessive maneuvering, sometimes deviating from standard procedures. There had also been growing concerns about crew fatigue, a factor that had played a role in numerous aviation disasters before. Investigators began questioning the airline's training protocols. Were Gulf Air pilots being pushed too hard? Were they receiving adequate training in go-around procedures? The deeper they looked, the more they found inconsistencies in how the airline was managing its flight crews. But nothing would be as revealing as what lay hidden in the cockpit voice recorder. The CVR tells a disturbing story. When forensic specialists finally analyzed the cockpit voice recorder, what they found was deeply unsettling. The pilots had been in a state of confusion and stress during the final moments of the flight. The audio revealed a mismanaged go-around maneuver, one of the most fundamental skills in commercial aviation. When Flight 072 had been instructed to abort its landing attempt and make another approach, the pilots failed to properly configure the aircraft for a stable climb. Instead of smoothly re-entering the approach pattern, the captain had allowed the aircraft to enter an aggressive and unstable descent. The data from the flight recorder confirmed this. Rather than gradually descending at a safe rate, the aircraft had dropped far too quickly, at nearly 3,200 feet per minute, an unsustainable and dangerous rate. The cockpit recordings revealed something even more chilling. The Ground Proximity Warning System, GPWS, had repeatedly issued alerts in the final seconds of the flight. Sink rate, pull up, sink rate, pull up. But the response from the pilots had been delayed and ineffective. The aircraft continued its rapid descent until it was too late. The final moments captured in the CVR were the sound of sheer panic, a desperate last-second attempt to recover the aircraft. Then, silence. A critical turning point in the investigation. By now, investigators had enough evidence to piece together a likely cause of the crash. The accident was not due to mechanical failure or weather. It was the result of pilot disorientation and mismanagement of a go-around procedure. The pilots had likely become confused by the aircraft's descent behavior, failing to recognize the danger until it was too late. But this finding led to an even bigger question. How could an experienced captain allow such a fundamental error to happen? The truth was about to emerge, and what investigators would uncover next would not only expose flaws in Gulf Air's training system, but also reveal a tragic human factor, one that had played a direct role in the deaths of 143 people. The evidence was mounting, and with each new revelation, the investigation into Gulf Air Flight 072 took a disturbing turn. The black boxes had confirmed what investigators feared. This was not an accident caused by mechanical failure or adverse weather. It was a direct result of human error. But how? How could two trained pilots allow a modern Airbus A320 to crash into the Persian Gulf on what should have been a routine approach? The answer lay in a deadly combination of fatigue, overconfidence, poor communication, and critical misjudgments, a chain of errors that, once set in motion, proved irreversible. A fatigued captain, a struggling first officer, investigators turned their attention to Captain Ihab Aladdin, the man in command of Flight 072. With nearly 7,000 flight hours, he was considered an experienced pilot, but his career profile revealed something troubling. He had been flying an extremely tight schedule, racking up long hours with limited rest in between. Fatigue had become a silent but significant factor, clouding his judgment in a high-stakes situation. Fatigue is one of the most insidious threats in aviation. Unlike a mechanical failure, which can be diagnosed and fixed, a fatigued mind is unpredictable, slow to react, and prone to poor decision-making. And on that fateful evening, Captain Aladdin's exhaustion may have been a hidden danger long before the aircraft ever began its descent. Then, there was First Officer Ahmed Omar. At 25 years old, he was relatively new to commercial aviation. He was competent, but lacked extensive experience in high-pressure situations. The cockpit voice recorder revealed hesitation and uncertainty in his responses, especially as the descent became erratic. His voice at times lacked confidence, a dangerous trait when quick, decisive action was needed. Together, they formed a cockpit crew that was unbalanced, a fatigued captain at the controls and a first officer hesitant to challenge his superiors. Decisions. This dynamic would prove disastrous in the final minutes of Flight 072. The go-around gone wrong. One of the most troubling aspects of the crash was the improper execution of a go-around, a standard maneuver taught to every commercial pilot. When Bahrain's air traffic control instructed Flight 072 to abort its landing and circle for another approach, this should have been routine. Instead, the sequence of events that followed was anything but over-aggressive pitch-up. When the captain initiated the go-around, he pulled the nose of the aircraft up too sharply. This caused a rapid gain in altitude, which was unstable and unnecessary. The Airbus A320's automated systems detected this excessive climb and reacted by trying to compensate, reducing engine thrust to prevent a stall. A dangerous loss of airspeed. As the thrust decreased, so did the aircraft's airspeed. The pilots failed to recognize that they were now in a high-risk situation where a loss of control was imminent, a sudden and uncontrolled descent. Instead of smoothly leveling off and maintaining control, the captain pushed the nose of the aircraft downward too aggressively. The descent became dangerously fast, over 3,200 feet per minute, a rate that no commercial jet should ever sustain on final approach. Ground proximity warnings ignored. The aircraft's warning systems began screaming for attention. The ground proximity warning system, GPWS, blared, "Sink rate, pull up, sink rate, pull up." But the pilots, now overwhelmed and confused, failed to respond effectively. The cockpit recordings painted a chilling picture. The warnings grew more urgent. The pilots struggled to regain control, but their delayed reactions sealed their fate. By the time the captain attempted to correct the descent, it was too late. The last few seconds, at 19:30. Local time, Gulf Air Flight 072 was just 3 nautical miles from the runway, plummeting toward the Persian Gulf at an extreme angle. Passengers, many of whom were likely unaware of the full gravity of the situation, would have felt the aircraft's unnatural movements. First a steep climb, then a rapid and terrifying dive. In the cockpit, The final moments were a blur of desperate actions. The captain yanked the controls in an attempt to pull the aircraft back up, but the Airbus was moving too fast, too low. The engines, now thrusting at maximum power, could no longer compensate. At an altitude of just 600 feet, the captain's last transmission was recorded, a frantic, half-spoken command to pull up. A second later, the aircraft slammed into the water at 261 knots, 484 km/h. The tragic reality, a preventable disaster. The findings were in, and they were damning. This crash should never have happened. The Airbus A320 was a technologically advanced aircraft, fully capable of handling a go-around maneuver without issue. The weather was clear, with no external factors affecting the flight. The pilots had multiple opportunities to correct their errors, but failed to do so in time. The final conclusion was heartbreaking. The disaster was entirely preventable. What were they thinking? One of the most haunting questions in aviation disasters is, what were they thinking? And in the case of Flight 72, that question had a devastating answer. The pilots failed to recognize their mistakes in time to save the flight. Their poor decision-making, fatigue, and failure to execute a basic go-around maneuver turned what should have been a routine second approach into a deadly nosedive. The investigation's report placed significant blame on Gulf Air's training. Protocols. The airline's procedures for handling go-arounds were found to be lacking, and concerns over cockpit discipline had not been adequately addressed. In response, Gulf Air was forced to overhaul its pilot training programs, implementing stricter guidelines to ensure that no future flight would suffer the same fate. But for the families of the 143 victims, no amount of policy changes could erase the pain of losing their loved ones. Their grief was compounded by the knowledge that this tragedy was the result of human error, avoidable, yet irreversible. A legacy of lessons. Aviation is an industry that learns from its failures. Each disaster, no matter how tragic, leads to new safety improvements. Gulf Air Flight 072 became a case study in pilot error, cockpit discipline, and the critical importance of go-around training. Airlines around the world took note, reinforcing the importance of stabilized approaches, automated system management, and, above all, effective communication in the cockpit. But for those who lost their lives on that fateful evening, these lessons came too late. Gulf Air Flight 072, a flight that should have landed safely in Bahrain, became a chilling reminder of the devastating consequences of human error in aviation. And in the end, the world was left asking, what were they thinking?